Ladies and gentlemen, we have a Caro Kann. My name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over the board chess player, and in this series, we're going from 1000 to 2000 ELO in chess.com rapid games. And during the games, I'm going to be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and entertainment. In today's game, we have a Caro Kann Defense against Filtint from, is that Australia or New Zealand? I have no idea, to be honest. It's Australia. Okay, I can never tell the difference. My opponent plays a knight f3 and e5 setup. And it's interesting because it's an advanced Caro Kann, essentially. But white hasn't yet committed his pawn to d4. And technically he doesn't have to, but he probably should. I think we'll start with bishop to g4, just pinning the knight to the queen. That looks very logical. And I think we just follow up with the move e6. And we kind of just have a perfect Caro Kann setup on move 5. My opponent goes d4, and I think the move c5 makes an awful lot of sense, preparing knight to c6. This is a dream setup. It's a slightly strange move order, actually. And I'll show you in the analysis of the game a more typical move order. This is an odd move order for sure, but black has everything. We've got everything we want. If you play the Caro Kann, or you're looking to play the Caro Kann, this is the kind of setup that you dream about. Let me just turn off my monitor quickly, because I always look at my recording thing, and it must be kind of off-putting for those of you watching. Bishop f4 is played, which I think is a mistake. This bishop doesn't typically go to the f4 square. Normally it goes to e3, because d4 is the pawn I'm going after, right? My bishop is obviously putting pressure on the knight, which is defending d4. And my knight and my pawn are both putting pressure on d4. Bishop f4, I think, just allows queen b6. We could take first, but I think my opponent played bishop f4 so that if I take the pawn, he wants to take with the knight so that I can't take on e5. Because it's obviously defended. My bishop would be under attack there, I am aware. I think queen b6 makes a lot of sense, because not only do we put pressure on a d4 square, but because the bishop has moved to f4, we also have pressure on b2. Sometimes taking on b2 in these kinds of lines is bad, and is like a poisoned pawn. Because sometimes, moves like rook b1, rook b7 can be very scary counter-attacking. But we don't actually have to take it. The queen on b6, yes, it attacks b2, but it also just applies more pressure to the d4 pawn. So after something like let's say my opponent takes on c5 to try and liquidate the pressure, I of course take with the bishop, threatening the f2 pawn. My opponent probably has to castle there. And then I'd even be tempted to play queen c7, so that the bishop can always drop back to b6, and we start applying pressure to the e5 pawn, because if my opponent does take on c5, this pawn is no longer defending the e5 pawn, it's disappeared. So e5 becomes the weakness that we start to target. A big part of the Caro Kann advanced variation is that if your opponent creates this kind of connect 4 pawn chain, you try and break it down. That is kind of the goal. You try and remove some piece of the pawn chain, whether by taking and removing the c3 pawn so that d4 becomes weak, or encouraging your opponent to take with the d pawn so that e5 becomes weak, or even targeting the base of the pawn chain at b2. This is very, very common. And my opponent can certainly go wrong here. I mean, a move like b3, I assume, doesn't lose on the spot, but it's not good. If b3, I think we actually had this in a very recent episode of the rating climb. And by the way, there's going to be 2 playlists linked below. One with every video on my channel with the Caro Kann Defense, if you want to learn more about the opening. And another with all the previous episodes of the speedrun, if you want to follow that right from the start. b3, I think just something like take, and queen takes, forking the queen, the bishop, and the rook, forcing a trade of queens. Attacking the bishop, attacking c2, the bishop would have to go back to f1 probably to defend the threat and so that it doesn't get taken with check and double pawns. And then we're just a pawn up. And we've had a very similar position to that just a few episodes ago, I am sure, which just goes to show how powerful the Caro Kann can be. As in, potentially, if my opponent goes b3, we get a very similar, very winning position where we are a pawn up, but it's even better because we'll just dominate the c file. Our bishop will get out probably to b4 or even c5. Our knight will get to its desired f5 square most likely, or maybe even g6 or even c6 to go after the weak e5 pawn, because of course if we do get something like this, obviously we'll take the knight first. We remove all of these pawns from the pawn chain, actually, going back to what I was saying previously, which of course leaves e5 very, very weak, especially if this knight gets removed, which is, of course, defending the pawn. The Caro Kann, I think, white can do a lot of things against it, particularly in things like the advanced variation. There's loads of different setups that white can take up, which is why I don't really, in my videos, try to just reel off memorized lines. I don't even memorize that many lines myself, and you might, maybe with good reason, say that that is a bad way to go about it, and you might as well just memorize the ways to play. But as we saw, as we have seen in quite a few previous videos, especially around this rating range, your opponent isn't necessarily going to play the main lines. So you need to understand why you're playing the moves that you're playing, not just what the moves are, because what happens when your opponent does something different? You need to understand what the point is. I understood that I've never seen this bishop f4 move in this position, but I understood that the bishop belongs on e3 typically, and also the bishop not being on c1 means that b2 is undefended. I also knew this b3 move was a thing that I've seen before, which should allow me to take on f3. This is how I believe chess should be played. I'm going to take on f3. I'm going to get the position that I wanted to get. Now, my opponent could try taking on c5 first, but it doesn't work for several reasons. Firstly, if he takes on c5, I can just take the bishop, and if he takes my queen, I take his queen, and we just have a piece. Secondly, if take, I can always take with a bishop and threaten on f2. So if bishop f3, I can take on f2 with check, but I think just taking the bishop would be better. My opponent takes back. And now we liquidate to winning, well, not quite an endgame, but we are going to get a winning position, and we're going to do it by force. Because after take, my opponent has to trade the queens. There is also no queen a4 ideas, not only because b3 blocks that, but because my knight is also blocking the diagonal. It's important that e6 has been included, because in a lot of these lines, the bishop is able to take on d5 at the end of the line, and black is not better there. But because e6 is included, that is not a thing. That is worth noting if you play the Caro Kann. Again, I'm saying these kinds of things because I don't believe you should just mindlessly memorize the lines. I'm saying, like, you know, bishop takes d5 ideas often exist after bishop takes f3. So you just need to be aware of it and apply that thought process to the positions that you're getting. Here, I mean, you could throw a check like this in, but I actually don't think that helps black whatsoever. We can do that at any point. Let's take on d4. And because the bishop, the queen, and the rook are all hit, I don't think white has a choice. He actually just resigns. He would have had to do this, and the bishop is under attack, and knight c2 is threatened. You can't castle to get out of it because your rook is still going to hang. So you would have to play a move like bishop to d1 here to defend the c2 square and avoid getting taken. And then we can just develop with tempo, probably. Moves like bishop to b4 check. Maybe bring the knight to e7 and g6. It's a very easy game. Rook c8 is always on the cards. Maybe a bit of a premature resignation from my opponent. And I also don't think we need to go into really any analysis on that game. I think that I kind of explained everything I wanted to explain. So let's just jump into a second game. Why not? Why not? That was a short game. We have the white pieces against Ura Durkach from Ukraine, 1450 rated. I don't know why I was taking so long there. I was waiting for my opponent to move, but we have the white pieces, of course. And my opponent goes c5. Now, my recommendation against c5 is actually something I learned in a Gotham chess course, which is the move a3. We are preparing to play b4 and try and gambit a pawn in a very strange manner. And this could be a quick win if my opponent steps wrong. The whole point is just to gambit the pawn. But we have a lot of compensation. After c3, knight c6, d4, we take a massive center. Both my bishops are open. My queen is open. My knight's ready to get into the game. This other knight's ready to get into the game. My rook applies pressure to a7. There's ideas of like knight a3, knight b5 in some lines where a6 doesn't help black to stop me getting in because you can't take, because your rook will hang, because my rook is open. Very interesting lines. e6 played from my opponent. I'm going to play bishop to d3. This is very thematic because d5 I want to meet with e5, opening up my bishop. Okay, that's an interesting move. I assume he wants to come to g6, so I'm half tempted to play the move h4, which I think I'm going to play. h4 is just a very common move in these lines anyway, because often black will play the move g6, because in a lot of lines, queen g4 happens, applying pressure to the g7 square, especially when there's no knight f6 to attack the queen. And of course, because there's a pawn on e6, the bishop isn't going to attack the queen. We're going to play the move e5. The computer doesn't necessarily think that e5 is the best move in some of these lines, but I absolutely love this pawn structure for white because we have such a good hold over black's dark squares with the e5 pawn, which is very well supported. And because black lacks a c pawn to go to c5 to attack my pawn chain, it's very difficult for him to break it down. We kind of saw this in the previous game, where it's a similar pawn structure. In fact, there's even a pawn on b2 for the white pieces. But because we had the move c5, we could undermine the pawn chain immediately, and we won the game because of it. We just undermined the pawn chain from white. The point of this gambit is kind of to trade off black's c pawn for your a and b pawn. And of course, black is up a pawn. But when you then construct this pawn chain, it doesn't always get constructed like this, but I would say 60% of the games this kind of thing happens. Black has no c5. Black needs c5. Knight f5 played. I kind of want to play g4. But I think that black can just take on h4. So I'm thinking I should start with queen g4. But then I can't play g4. I could go knight f3 and then g4, which does look tempting. Of course, I could take and ruin black's structure, but we could do that at any point. We don't need to rush that idea at all. Let me think a second. Yeah, I'm going to go knight f3. I'm going to go knight f3. Just defend the h4 pawn, and I may castle kingside at some point. There is a very good chance my king just stays in the center, because, believe it or not, it's actually pretty safe, and it can always go to the f1 square, because black will struggle to put a bishop on a6 to target it anyway, and because I have such good control of the center, I'm not too concerned. Bishop e7. Well, now I'm very tempted to play g4. Because if knight takes, bishop takes... Let me think. I'm trying to make the move g5 work. g5, bishop takes g5. Doesn't quite work. Doesn't quite. If black was castled, I would go for that. But he's not castled yet. We could play king f1, but I don't want to give that away just yet. We could play knight b to d2, maybe. Although I think knight to a3 is probably more natural, either trying to get into b5, which is very typical of these lines, or rotating back to c2 and then maybe coming into e3, because its natural developing square on c3 has been taken away by the pawn, which does mean d4 is well defended, but it means this knight is a bit meh. We could take the knight. That is always on the cards, but I'm not sure what my follow-up is. I'm not sure. Bishop g5 is playable. Maybe we should play it. Bishop g5, if bishop takes... I don't think I can take the knight with the knight because of knight to h4 ideas. That feels a little bit risky. I also don't really want to trade off my dark squared bishop, to be honest, because it's a very powerful piece alongside my light squared bishop. Okay, well, h4 is under attack. We could play h5, and we do control the g5 square very well, so we don't have to worry about black trading bishops with me or anything. If h5, then g4 is more of a threat, because after knight to h4, I mean, I can just let black take me. His knight is a bit weird there. And then h6 ideas exist anyway. So maybe h5 is a good move. It looks kind of silly, but I kind of like it. Yeah, he does go knight h4, but we don't have to do anything. We can just leave the knight there. Of course, we can play h6 whenever we want, but black is just going to go g6. And then the knight is very secure on the f5 square. So I'm just not going to do anything. I might just go knight a3 and try and get into b5, or again, rotate to c2. I am giving up this g2 pawn, but king f1, what, you're just going to go back? I kind of want the open g file, to be honest. I'm not scared of that at all. In fact, wait. In this position, could I have gone for this? Oh, wait, I think I can just do this. I think I just overlooked that. Yeah, no, that's completely winning. Why did I not? I don't know why I didn't play that. Yeah, the bishop on h5 just sucks. Queen g4. And you can see just how powerful these attacking ideas are in this line. And here, black would be absolutely fine if he could play bishop to f6, getting his bishop out of danger and defending the g7 square. But as I was banging on about several moves ago, I love this pawn structure because we suffocate the black position on the dark squares. And of course, black's already committed basically all his pawns to light squares, so he doesn't have much mobility on the light squares anyway, of his own making. But black doesn't have bishop f6. He has to go all the way back to e7, or play the move g5, which I did see. But I think we just take en passant, and black is still busted, because the bishop is still under attack. And if anything, it's even worse now for black, because bishop e7, firstly, we could just take on f7. Black can do this, but I think we just go g3, bishop f6, then bishop f6 works. Interesting. You know what a cool move here is? I think bishop g5 works. Because if queen takes, bishop takes, then we just take here. If bishop here, bishop f2 check, king takes, you can't take on h1 because your queen hangs. Pawn g3 doesn't really work because of bishop f6, defending the rook, and my rook is hanging, so I would have to trade rooks with him. I can also consider the move bishop takes g6, and if takes, we have an interesting attack. But I think if take, black just takes on f2 with check, and then our king takes, and then he takes our rook, and then I don't think we have any threats. I think bishop g5 wins. Again, we can actually go for this knight to b5 line here and try and get into d6 because the pawn cannot take as the pawn is pinned to the rook, which again is something I was mentioning earlier on in the game. This a6 move is a lot less effective with the a file open for my rook. But I think bishop g5. I think bishop g5 just wins. Let me check a second. If bishop takes, we take the rook, game over. If queen takes, we take the queen. He has to take back or he's down a queen, and then we win the rook and the game is over. If bishop g5, bishop f2, king f2, you can't take my rook because your queen is hanging. You have to move your queen, and then I just win your rook. f5 I don't think helps. I don't think that does anything. It attacks my queen. But we could even just take the bishop. And if you take my queen, then I take on h8 with check. And you lose your queen anyway. So, yeah, I mean, we could probably just take en passant. But yeah, here, I'm pretty sure we just take the queen. Yeah. And then we're going to go up and exchange. And it's worse than that for black, though, because we have a completely dominant position. If I've calculated this correctly anyway, which I hope I have. And we are still down a pawn. I am well aware we're still down a pawn. But this is, like, these are black's pawns, like, his extra pawns. This sucks, right? This sucks for black. And knight to b5, I think, is probably the best move. c4 often exists in these positions, but here it would just hang a pawn. Yeah, knight b5 has to be the move. because knight d6 is such a big threat, just targeting the bishop, and it's difficult to defend the bishop. It is also worth noting even, that this pawn structure also does a great job at locking this knight out of the game, because the c-pawn just controls its movement forward here, the d-pawn controls its movement on to the e5 square, and yeah, my opponent resigns because he can't really do anything to stop this. If he plays a move like king to d7, I could still just jump in, and we are attacking so many different things, and we have so much pressure, that even if we don't have an immediate win, like, what can black do? Like, knight d8? Defending f7 and blocking this off? I mean, sure, you can play that, but I even have moves like bishop b5 check. You can't take because I'll take your rook. If you play, I don't know, king c7, I could even play bishop to e8 and just gang up on the f7 pawn. I could bring the rook to h7. Black is busted. Now, I do think I didn't quite handle this game perfectly. So let's just check what I could have done better. Let me just get the game review up. 1 second. Okay, I think I made one bad move, and I think that was probably after knight to h4. I should have taken and gone queen g4. But let's check. a3, knight c6, b4, take, c3, knight c6, d4. We take the massive center. Most of the time, you will see the move d5 here. And this is a very, very trappy line. I think I've won 70-75% of my games from this position, which is ridiculous. Check, there'll be, well, now 3 playlists linked below, but one of them will be every game on this channel in the A3 Sicilian. So check that out down below if you want to learn more about this kind of position. But a lot of people get a bit nervous about playing the move d5, which is understandable. My opponent goes e6, which is a fine move, preparing the move d5. Bishop d3. Knight ge7, which is an odd move, to be honest. That isn't very typical. h4 the computer does actually like, because the knight kind of belongs on the g6 square. And obviously, if knight g6, we just go h5, and we're really winning. We're really winning. My opponent goes d5, we play e5. Here it is the best move. Sometimes it isn't, but I still like the move e5 in a lot of these scenarios. For example, there is a line in the A3 Sicilian where instead of knight c6, black plays the move e6. I still like going for the gambit like this. And after this position, I think sometimes the computer likes taking, but again, e5 is very, very strong because we take away the f6 square, queen g4 ideas are ready, bishop d3 is still happening, and even though it's a completely different move order, you get the same kind of structure. Yeah, my opponent goes d5, we push, knight f5 is a good move. Knight f3 is fine here. Bishop e7. Computer wants to castle? Oh no, it actually prefers my h5 move. That is crazy. h5. I'm really glad I found that. That's quite cool. h5, I mean, gets the pawn out of the firing line. It's also kind of a waiting move, because I'm like, what are you going to do? Because this pressure is really starting to mount. And I'm not sure what your plan is. Like, the computer's favorite move is a6 here. Or bishop d7, or knight a5. Who plays knight a5? Like, come on. a6, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. A lot of the time, black has to try and go for like a b5, bishop b7 thing. But it's not even that simple. Rook h3 is the best move here. But even king f1 the computer likes, which I mentioned before. But a move like b5 can't be played immediately because, of course, we take. And like I said, the a-pawn is pinned. So you've got to start with bishop d7, rook h3. This is just the sample line. And then go b5. And yeah, you advance these pawns a bit, but they're not going anywhere. Like, b4 is never really going to work. And of course, if you play a5, you just hang the b5 pawn. The positions are very, very difficult for black. And I have a great win rate in this opening because of it. Here, yeah, I should have just taken and played queen g4. I'm not really sure why I missed that. It's the exact same idea as what I played in the game. I went knight to a3. Black kind of has to take. Taking on g2 doesn't really help because you've just got to go back to h4 and this same plan ensues. It's probably actually a bit better for me because I've got the open g file as well. And if you go for this g5 plan again, after takes, there's also no bishop f2 with check ideas anymore. And again, bishop g5 is the best move. So I'm very happy I found that in the line that we played. But knight a3, I do allow knight takes f3, which is what black should have gone for. I'm still much better, because even if black does get this, knight b5 is an idea. These bishops are monsters. My queen is already involved. h6 is coming. A rook lift is coming. The king is just going to go to f1 or even g1 and be completely safe. Black is completely busted. Completely busted. a6 is played, of course, stopping my knight from coming to b5. And now I finally realise that knight takes h4 is the best move. Bishop takes queen g4, g5. If you go bishop e7, queen g7, the rook has to go to f8. I can still play knight b5 according to the engine. However, I would probably just take on h7, put the queen back on g7, and push this pawn to promotion. That is a very common idea in this opening when you can win the kingside pawns of, like, win the kingside pawns on g7 and h7. And because the h pawn often advances up the board for white to apply pressure, it can just promote in a lot of lines. So yeah, my opponent tries to move g5, which I think is more resilient than playing bishop e7. Interestingly, this is an inaccuracy. Knight b5 is better. Just getting into d6, and I suppose the bishop clearly can't retreat anymore. Let's say black rook f8. I mean, there's nothing. g3 now traps the bishop. I just had to be a bit patient, because as long as I don't take en passant... Can I not play g3 already? Yeah, I can just play it immediately. I probably should have given that a bit more thought. I didn't really spend any time on this move. I should have thought about that a bit more, but it's all winning. It's all winning. hg6. And I've seen this pattern before. Now, I rejected the move g3 because of bishop to f6, right? And I can't take the bishop because my rook hangs. I've got to go for this, then knight b5 trying to get into d6, which, of course, the bishop can no longer guard this diagonal anymore because it's on h8. King d7. Okay, nobody's playing that. I think a more natural move might be rook b8, getting the rook off of the pin. Bishop g5 is a move. Queen d7, knight d6, king f8. And the computer wants to somehow batter down the door. I suppose that threatens taking on g6. And also threatens the f7 pawn, which is currently defended, but, you know, pressure. Yeah, I don't know. I think that my plan, personally, was a lot easier. Because after bishop g5, black's best move is to go queen a5. And bishop d2 is the best move. But what about queen just back to d8? Okay, yeah, then it really wants this g3 idea. That's interesting. I didn't think this was a concern at all. But I suppose I can't really take this, because queen c3 and literally everything is hit. Maybe I should have thought about that a bit more. King e2 is the second best move. That's hilarious. But, interesting from my opponent. He takes on g5, though. And here we just liquidate into an endgame when we're a pawn down, we're an exchange up, but there's knight b5. And black has no development. He's completely locked in, like, to his position. His king is stranded, and knight d6 is coming. So here my opponent resigned, but, I mean, the computer's favourite line, bishop c1. Is this the threat? I mean, if I take, then I understand you take on b5. I might have to do that to stop bishop to b2. I could just go rook a2, though. And if bishop b2... Again, I could just take. But I could also just go like this. Or I could just go king d2, defending the pawn. Then the computer wants to sack the rook. The game's completely over. I mean, some of the lines I was pointing out in the game, with like like king d7, knight d6, knight d8 defending the pawn. And then we can even do things like bishop b5, king c7, bishop to e8, or rook h7, and the game is over. The game is over. But yeah, I think I'll leave it there, because I know they were 2 short games, but I think they were 2 very interesting games. So I hope you guys enjoyed. If you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, can I get my angles right? The playlist will be down there. And if you want to see a really cool game with the A3 Sicilian, again, then check the video out up there. Thank you very much for watching.